My mentor betrayed me for fame, so I exposed his dirty secrets in front of everyone. If you've ever placed your dreams in someone else's hands, only to watch them crush them for their own gain, then you already know how my story begins. I am Eliana Bishop, 30, hungry, passionate, maybe a little naive, but above all, I believed in storytelling, the kind that exposes truth, even if it terrifies the world. And I believed in Julian Hale, the legendary filmmaker, my mentor, my hero. At least, he used to be. We met when I submitted my first short doc to an independent film festival. Julian was a guest speaker. I was an afterthought. But somehow he noticed me, or so I thought. He called my work raw genius. He said I had an eye most filmmakers would kill for. He invited me to intern on his upcoming feature, a gritty expose on political corruption. It felt like destiny handing me a camera. I dropped everything. My steady editing job, my rent-controlled apartment, even my mother's cautious warnings. Julian's world was intoxicating, full of film screenings, deep conversations over wine, and promises whispered like scripture. Stick with me, Eliana. I'll make sure your voice is heard. If you're wondering how this all began, let me take you back to where it started. It was the first night I stepped into his studio, the place he called the workshop. The walls were covered in framed stills, festival passes, and hand-scribbled storyboards. The air smelled of aged paper, warm coffee, and ambition. I remember feeling like I'd stepped into a cathedral. And Julian, well, he was the priest. He gave me a small project at first, organizing footage, syncing sound. But then came the real assignment, developing my own short film under his guidance. He said he wanted to mentor a real storyteller. So I poured myself into the story, a film about systemic abuse in elite prep schools. It was raw, honest, and terrifying, but it was mine. Sophie, my best friend and editor, worked nights with me. Evan, a sound designer I barely knew, stayed late to clean up audio. We built it in silence, in shadows, and in trust, until the day everything changed. I walked into the screening room expecting feedback on my rough cut. Instead, I saw Julian, presenting my film under his white name to a room full of investors. He called it his vision. He spoke my words, my shots, my pain, like it was a monologue he'd rehearsed. I felt my chest collapse inward, like all the oxygen had been siphoned from the room. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, listening to the man I once admired twist my truth into currency. He never looked ashamed, not even for a second. He smiled as the investors applauded. Then he turned to me, winked, and said, "You're learning how the game works, Eliana." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my apartment floor, surrounded by crumpled notes, unfinished clips, and betrayal so loud it echoed in every corner. Sophie was the first to say it out loud. "He stole from you." But I already knew, and that's when something inside me changed. Not just the anger, not just the heartbreak, but the realization that he'd done this before. Julian wasn't a mentor. He was a collector of broken voices, stolen ideas, and fading relevance. But I wasn't going to be his next trophy. No. He thought I was soft. He thought I would stay silent. He thought wrong, because if he was going to steal my story, I'd make sure the world knew the real ending. And trust me, it wouldn't be pretty. Let me take you back to where it all started, where the lines between admiration and betrayal began to blur. I was still glowing from the success of my first gallery showcase, with people murmuring praise and collectors starting to notice my name. but standing just behind me in every photo was Everett Langston, my mentor, my idol, the man who once told me I had a vision the world wasn't ready for. His words wrapped around me like velvet. But little did I know, they were laced with thorns. Everett had always been charismatic, but lately, he'd become magnetic in a different way, greedy for attention. At panels, he spoke over me. At gallery meetings, he presented my ideas as his own, smirking as if he were doing me a favor, and when I'd try to correct it gently, he'd say with that condescending smile, "Eliana, this is how the game is played. Learn to take the win." At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just trying to protect me from the cutthroat nature of the industry. Maybe he saw himself in me and was simply guiding me. But the gut feeling, it never lies. And mine whispered that something was off. Deeply off. The way he began to talk to curators about our collaborative work, when it was my solo pieces. The way my sketches disappeared from our shared Dropbox folders. The way he introduced me as his student, even when I was clearly leading the project. It was subtle, too subtle to call out without sounding paranoid. But betrayal never arrives loudly. It drips in slowly, eroding trust like water on stone. One afternoon, I found myself invited to a private event, hosted by one of the most influential gallery owners in New York, Margot Duchamp. I had no idea how she found my work, but the invitation felt like destiny. When I arrived, dressed in a simple black dress with my hair pulled back in confidence, I saw Everett already there, sipping wine like he owned the room. He looked surprised to see me, almost threatened. I should have trusted that look. During the event, I spoke with Margot. Her eyes lit up when I described my latest collection. Visions in silence. But then, her face twisted slightly. "Wait," she said. "Everett already pitched me that concept. Said it was his next solo show." My blood ran cold. I laughed it off, but inside, I was burning. That was my idea. The one I'd kept sacred. The one I only ever shared in my notebook. And with Everett. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment, lights off, sketchbook open but untouched. My hands trembled with a rage I couldn't yet define. Was it betrayal? Was it heartbreak? Was it the death of who I thought he was? I started piecing things together. How my old portfolios had gone missing. How the backup drive in the studio was wiped last week. How he'd stopped letting me access our shared presentation decks. It wasn't mentorship anymore. It was sabotage, dressed as support. The next morning, I confronted him. Calm, direct, eyes steady. The kind of confrontation that tastes like copper in your mouth because you know what's about to shatter. "Did you pitch my series to Margot?" I asked. He blinked, then smiled. "Our series, Eliana. Everything you do, I've helped shape. You wouldn't be here without me." And just like that, the illusion crumbled. It wasn't just theft. It was entitlement. He believed he owned my ideas, my effort, my future. Like I was a ladder he could climb and discard once he reached the spotlight. That moment, that cold, dismissive smile, it sealed something in me. Not defeat, not sorrow, fire. I didn't react in front of him. I nodded, thanked him, and left. But inside, something woke up. Something raw and focused. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't beg. I would rise, in silence. And when I exposed him, the whole world would finally see the truth. Not just about Everett Langston, but about every false prophet who builds his legacy on stolen dreams. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button to join me through this wild journey of betrayal and unexpected triumph. Because this is just the beginning. And the mask, it hasn't even fully fallen yet. If you've ever felt the sting of being silenced in a room you helped build, then you'll understand what came next. After that confrontation with Everett, the moment he claimed my vision as ours, something inside me hardened. Not bitterness. Not yet. It was clarity. And clarity is a dangerous thing when you've been underestimated for too long. I started watching more closely, listening between the lines. Artists talk. Curators whisper. The industry has its back hallways of gossip, and Everett's name was always floating around. Always polished, always pristine. But beneath the gloss, I started noticing cracks. At gallery meetings, I began recording our conversations. Not secretly, but openly, under the guise of organization. He didn't flinch. Narcissists never do. They think they'll never be caught, because they believe their narrative is the only truth that matters. And that's when I met Lena Morell, an assistant curator who had worked with Everett years ago. She was quiet at first, hesitant. But when I mentioned the Visions in Silence debacle, her eyes darkened. "He did it to you too?" she asked. Just 6 words. And my heart thundered. Lena told me stories I wish I could unhear. About artists whose careers evaporated after Everett pushed them out. About women who had their exhibitions canceled after he spun lies about them being unreliable or overly emotional. She had proof. Emails. Old drafts. One document showed him changing a project credit from Lena Morell and team to Concept by Everett Langston, right before submitting it to a major award show. He won, of course. That night, Lena and I sat in my apartment, surrounded by notes, timelines, and recordings. We weren't just sharing tea. We were building a case. Our anger wasn't just personal anymore. It was historical, systemic, and overdue for a reckoning. "If you're wondering how this all began," I whispered into my journal, "let me take you back to the very first brushstroke I shared with him, and how he turned it into a weapon. It wasn't just theft. It was colonization of creativity. And I wasn't the only one scarred. I started rewriting my next collection, not as art, but as evidence. Abstract works that held within them hidden transcripts, QR codes, overlapping voices layered into the soundtrack of each installation. I called the new series Stolen Tongues. Because that's what he took. Our voices. At our next faculty meeting, Everett tried to pitch a project idea I had mentioned offhand weeks earlier, a digital mural archive for marginalized artists. But this time, I beat him to the punch. I handed out fully developed proposals, press kits, and a media pitch I had quietly sent to the New York Review of Art, which, by the way, already confirmed coverage. His face twisted. For the first time, Everett Langston was caught off guard. His confidence flickered. Not enough for most to notice. But I did. I saw the mask slip, if only for a second. He cornered me in the hallway later, smiling with teeth. "I hope you're not trying to compete with me, Eliana." I leaned in, voice like ice. "I'm not competing. I'm correcting the credits." That week, I went back through every contract, every shared email, every file. I compiled timelines and matched them to his public interviews, spotting quote after quote that was lifted word for word from my private messages. And I wasn't alone anymore. Lena and 2 other former mentees joined us, anonymously for now, but ready to step into the light when the moment was right. The gathering storm wasn't loud. It was organized, silent, precise. And then, just as things began to build, a letter arrived, an invitation to the National Creative Excellence Awards Gala. Everett was being honored, a Lifetime Achievement Award, and guess who they asked to present it? Me. Because if you think I was going to smile and hand him that trophy, think again. The stage was set. The storm had arrived. And this time, the applause would echo for the truth. The night of the gala arrived, and I stood before the mirror, clad in the same black velvet gown I had worn at my first gallery opening. Back then, Everett had dismissed it, saying, "You want your art to matter, not your dress." Tonight, that dress symbolized my resilience. The invitation read, National Creative Excellence Awards, but I knew it was Everett's coronation. He was to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, and I, Eliana Bishop, the mentee he had betrayed, was chosen to present it. As I stepped onto the stage, the lights illuminated the faces of critics, curators, and collectors, all part of Everett's world. I began, "If you're wondering how this all began, let me take you back to a single studio, a single promise, and a single betrayal." The room fell silent, tension palpable. I spoke of a mentor who nurtured talent publicly, but stole it privately, who built his reputation on the ideas of others. "Tonight, we celebrate genius," I continued, "but should we not also question the source of that genius?" Everett sat in the front row, his smile faltering. I held up a folder. Contained here are years of correspondence, drafts, and voice memos, proof of theft, manipulation, and calculated erasure. Gasps echoed through the hall. Everett stood, protesting. "This is not the place." "It is exactly the place," I interjected. "You built this throne on lies, Everett. Tonight, I dismantle it, one truth at a time." A screen descended, displaying emails, side-by-side comparisons of my journals and his speeches, and testimonies from others he had wronged. The audience watched in stunned silence. A woman in the back stood and began to clap, slowly. Others joined, not for drama, but for justice. Everett sat down, hands folded, defeated. I concluded, "Genius is not the absence of theft. True genius is the courage to create without destroying others." The applause was thunderous, but I felt no triumph, only a sense of justice served, because this is just the beginning. The fallout is only starting, and Everett won't let this go quietly. The morning after the gala, the world felt louder. My phone buzzed nonstop. Messages, missed calls, interview requests, threats, apologies, strangers telling me I was brave, that I had done what so many only dream of, bringing down the untouchable. But in the quiet corners of my apartment, where the walls still held the scent of turpentine and old dreams, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like aftermath. Everett went silent for 2 days. Then, like a wounded wolf, he bared his teeth. A public statement was released through his PR team. He called me ungrateful, opportunistic, and mentally unstable. Said I had a vendetta, that my art never sold until he endorsed it, that I was twisting the truth for my own gain. His words were like poison laced in silk, clever, rehearsed, and terrifyingly manipulative. I read his statement twice, then printed it and pinned it above my easel. Not out of fear, but focus. "This is what power does when it's threatened," I whispered to myself. "It lies loud enough to drown the truth." But I wasn't about to drown. I had learned how to swim in far darker waters. By the 3rd day, galleries started pulling Everett's pieces from upcoming exhibitions. A few sponsors cut ties. His publisher postponed indefinitely the release of his memoir. I watched from the sidelines as the empire he built on the bones of others began to collapse. And yet, I felt no joy, only clarity. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about cleansing. One morning, I met Olivia Pierce, another artist he had silenced. She showed me a painting Everett once called his breakthrough, only this time the signature read, "O. Pierce." It was her brushwork, her story. He had buried her for nearly a decade. As we sat sipping bitter coffee, she looked at me and said, "You cracked the door. Now we all have a way out." But Everett wasn't done. He had power still, and pride sharper than any blade. He began sending private threats, veiled ones, coded and cruel, emails with no names, cryptic phrases like, "Careful what you start," and "You won't be remembered the way you think." My lawyer advised silence. My heart wanted war. Instead, I turned inward. I painted. I bled onto canvas. I began a new series, The Witnessed and the Withheld. Every piece told a story, mine, Olivia's, others who reached out. The works were raw, jagged and untamed, and they spread like wildfire online. Not because I marketed them, but because people saw their own scars in them. My art became a mirror, and people couldn't look away. A well-known curator reached out. She wanted to host a full exhibit, a solo show, entirely mine. No ghost mentors, no hidden fingerprints, just me. The girl who once thought her voice didn't matter, now commanding a room full of them. I cried after that call, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I realized I had finally painted in my own name, but the storm wasn't over. Everett had one card left to play, and he would play it soon, because what comes next will test everything: my name, my strength, and whether the truth can really survive when power fights back. They say when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. But what they don't tell you is how dangerous it is when the whole world has already bought into the lie. The gallery was packed, brimming with bodies and voices, each echoing anticipation, curiosity, whispers of controversy. My exhibition, The Witnessed and the Withheld, was the most talked about show of the season, not because of celebrity, not because of hype, but because it had teeth. It told the truth, and the truth has a pulse. Each painting was a confession, not in words, but in blood, breath, and brushstrokes. One showed Everett's hand over my canvas, stealing the brush. Another, his reflection in a shattered mirror, surrounded by the faces of artists he'd silenced. Visitors didn't just look. They felt. They cried. They stared in silence. Then he came in. Everett, dressed in arrogance and designer wool. He stood at the center of the gallery like he still owned the space. His eyes scanned the paintings with a calm so cold, it felt like sleet on skin. When our eyes met, it was as if the room stopped breathing. No words, just history, ugly, raw, unresolved, crackling in the silence between us. I walked up to him slowly, every step a reclaiming. "This is who I am now," I said softly. "Not your shadow, not your pawn, just the truth you tried to bury." He smirked, but the cracks showed in his composure, because this time I wasn't trembling. He was. He leaned in. "You think you've won, Eliana?" "No," I replied, steady. "I think I've begun." Hours later, as the crowd thinned, the real surprise unfolded. Olivia Pierce, Miles Chang, and 2 other artists he'd wronged revealed a joint lawsuit, naming Everett for plagiarism, defamation, and career sabotage. A legal avalanche was coming, and he was standing right in its path. The media pounced. The art world buzzed, but me. I stood beneath my favorite piece, Inheritance of Silence. It was a painting of a young woman, half covered in shadows, her mouth stitched closed with red thread. In her hand, a flame, small, but enough to burn a kingdom down. A little girl came up to me, no older than 8. She pointed at the painting and asked, "Why is she holding fire?" I knelt beside her, smiled gently, and whispered, "Because sometimes speaking your truth is the bravest fire of all." That night, I slept without fear. No threats, no whispers, no shame, just quiet and peace. Everett once told me, "Art is what you leave behind when your voice is gone." But he was wrong. My art didn't speak because my voice was gone. It roared because I finally found it. And I wasn't done. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button to join me through this wild journey of betrayal and unexpected triumph. Because the final chapter isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's just the beginning of the masterpiece. Fame fades, headlines blur, applause dies in echoes. But truth stains the canvas forever. 3 months had passed since the night I turned Everett's kingdom of lies into a gallery of reckoning. The art world hadn't just shifted, it had cracked open. People began asking questions that were once whispered behind closed doors. Students found their courage, silent artists found their voices, and I found my purpose. The lawsuit gained traction like wildfire in a dry forest. Testimonies poured in. Artists from different cities, different countries, emerged like stars after a storm. Each one had a story of being diminished, erased, manipulated by a man who wore charm like armor. And with every voice added, Everett's pedestal crumbled further. He tried to fight. Of course he did. He issued a statement claiming I was unstable, vindictive, obsessed. But this time, the world didn't swallow his narrative whole. They'd seen the brushstrokes. They'd heard the hush behind my colors. They'd felt the betrayal in every canvas I bared. And then came the fall. Everett Moore, once the darling of contemporary art, was stripped of his tenure. His gallery representation severed ties. His sponsors vanished. And when the verdict hit the news, liable on all counts, it wasn't a bang. It was silence. The kind that hums with justice. But this story was never about him. It was about me, Eliana Bishop, the girl once told she wasn't marketable, that her truth was too heavy, that her art wouldn't sell. The girl who hid in back rooms painting while someone else signed his name. Now, I stood beneath a new banner, the Bishop Collective, an incubator for underrepresented artists. The studio was built in a converted church, sunlight pouring through stained glass, casting colors onto canvases not yet born. It wasn't just a gallery, it was sanctuary, and it wasn't mine alone. Miles co-curated exhibitions now, his style flourishing. Olivia hosted monthly art therapy nights for trauma survivors. Even Sophia returned, after years of exile, to design our visual identity. We were a mosaic of the broken, who chose to rebuild. One afternoon, a young woman walked in, nervous, hopeful, clutching a portfolio like it held her breath. "Do you think I have a chance?" she asked, eyes trembling. I looked her in the eyes and smiled, the way no one had once done for me. "Not only do you have a chance," I said, "you have a voice. Let's help the world hear it." That was my redemption, not in the ruin of my betrayer, but in the rising of others who needed a hand when the world turned cold. As I stood before my newest piece, Legacy in Layers. A portrait of a faceless artist surrounded by those she had lifted. I felt something settle in my bones. Not revenge. not vindication, but peace, because I had become the woman he was afraid I'd grow into. Not because I chased fame, but because I painted my truth, fearlessly, unapologetically, in full color. And to anyone watching this, wondering if the pain they carry can ever become power, let me tell you, it can, and it will, because silence may be safe. But truth is immortal. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe in truth louder than fame, because this was just one brushstroke in a lifetime of justice. So that was my story, a journey painted in betrayal, brushed with heartbreak, and finished in the bold, unapologetic colors of justice. Everett thought he could silence me, use me, erase me, but I wasn't a footnote in his story. I was the author of my own. And to everyone out there who's been pushed into the shadows, told to stay quiet, or stripped of the credit they deserve, let this be your sign. Your silence is not your weakness. Your truth is your masterpiece. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't destroying someone else. It's finally creating something they could never steal. If this story moved you, let me know where you're watching from, and drop a comment below with the word resilience. So I know you're one of us, the ones who rise. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to join me every week for more stories of betrayal, heartbreak, karma, and ultimate revenge.